This commodity analysis seeks to explore the political, economic, historical, and cultural relations involved in the life cycle of notebook paper, from production to consumption. Notebook paper occupies an important place in our daily lives without much thought as to how it got there. I discovered that the paper that I consume every day is actually a part of a Tennessee-based firm called International Paper Company, one of the largest producers of paper products in the entire world. And even though this company's global headquarters is located just a state away, and it actually owns a paper mill right down the road in Georgetown, South Carolina, I learned that it is far more likely that my paper traveled all the way here from one of their multi-purpose plants in Brazil. Clearly, these paper products that we use every day make us, as consumers, important actors in a very mysterious international marketplace. The average American consumes around 749 pounds of paper annually and probably has very little idea as to how half of it ended up on the shelf of their local supply store. In order to understand our relationship in this life cycle of paper, we must first ask how it became a popular commodity in the first place. The first paper-like substance is believed to have been papyrus in Egypt over 6,000 years ago. Papyrus was created through a process of weaving and pounding roots and other plant matter together and leaving the resulting sheet out in the sun to solidify. Our modern concept of paper was not seen until 105 AD in China, where it was made from a combination of tree bark, hemp, cotton, and linen. This process was kept a secret for many years until the knowledge began to disperse to other areas of Asia and Europe with the increase in trade. However, paper production truly took shape far later with the advent of the type printing press and the subsequent increase in literacy rates and demand for books. With this burgeoning demand, there was a new market developing for mass paper production. Cloth continued to be a primary material in the mid-19th century when the process of pulping became popular and ground wood became the dominant ingredient in paper. Modern paper production follows four general stages: acquiring the raw material, processing it into pulp, rolling out the paper, and converting this large-scale paper into various paper products.
The basic raw material for making paper is wood. To begin, pulpwood logs are passed through a debarking drum in which they collide and rub together, removing the bark. The bark is collected and burned as fuel in the power boilers. The debarked logs are then conveyed to a chipper, which reduces them to small pieces. The chips are loaded into large vessels called digesters, where they are steamed under pressure until the mixture is reduced to a wet, oatmeal-like pulp. The cooking removes unwanted substances and frees the wood fibers so they can be suspended in a ratio of 200 parts water to 1 part fiber. This furnish, as it's called, is run onto a fast-moving mesh screen loop. As the water is extracted, the fibers form a mat of paper. The paper is pressed and passed through steam-heated drying cylinders where the last of the water is removed. A starch solution seals the paper surface to prevent excessive ink absorption during printing. Calendering provides a smooth finish by ironing the sheet between heavy, polished rollers. The paper is wound onto a great spool to form a machine reel, and then rewound and cut into smaller rolls. Some of these rolls are wrapped for shipment. Others are sent for sheeting and packing.
As demonstrated, the resources required for the paper production process play a very large role in selecting the ideal location for production facilities, the beginning of the paper's journey to consumption. Paper production requires high levels of energy and water on top of the basic wood materials needed for the actual product. Thus, locations with nearby water sources and options for on-site renewable energy are preferred. Also, since transporting the raw material is very expensive, regions with dense forest resources are favorable. This means that nations such as the United States and Canada, with an abundance of these natural resources, are at a comparative advantage to a nation like China, which lacks access to forests and therefore must import the raw material. Furthermore, paper production is largely correlated with domestic consumption, as the majority of final product is intended for the domestic market. Therefore, industrialized nations with a high demand for paper products and access to these geographic locations are more likely to excel than their developing counterparts. Moreover, in order to succeed in this industry, a company must not only have access to a desirable location and a public demand, but also must have mass capital to invest in the expensive purchase and maintenance of the machinery key to this process. Although nations with labor-intensive markets do enjoy a level of comparative advantage, the labor costs in this production are not great enough to yield substantial advantage, and it is the nations with capital-intensive markets which have the true upper hand. In order to be viable in this industry, firms must keep up with the latest and innovative technology so that their production rate and costs match those of their competitors. Due to this expensive nature of the machinery and the gross natural resource demands, barriers of entry to this industry are very high, and the global market is largely dominated by a select few firms. Vertical integration has allowed these firms to succeed so noticeably when they come to control the entire process of production, from the acquisition of raw materials all the way through the distribution of the final product. However, this production control does not guarantee success. The paper production industry fluctuates greatly with the demands of the global society. For example, rise in globalization and international trade created a new large demand for packaging supplies, which created a whole new market sector in the paper industry. Conversely, modernization also yields numerous negative impacts on the industry, as it calls for an increase in electronic communication, promotes the era of the new paperless office, and diminishes the popularity of print media, all of these being previously large market bases for paper producers. These kind of changes necessitate that paper firms focus more upon their specialized products and higher value items in order to set off the loss of these smaller items and maintain growth. While companies are constantly preoccupied with the impending demise of the paper's relevancy in the modern world, they are also confronted with the growing government regulation of their industry. Paper production in the United States serves an example of how political interference in the industry influences market activity greatly. In recent years, the industry has been characterized by a rapid growth in production rates in the non-traditional regions of China and Indonesia. Lacking the machinery knowledge and the natural resources in these nations means that naturally they would not be comparatively advantaged in this industry and should not be experiencing the level of success they've recently demonstrated. Therefore, several American firms asserted that these governments were heavily subsidizing paper manufacturers in their nations in order to make them competitive on the international market. Upon investigation, the International Trade Commission imposed anti-dumping and countervailing duties on the import of coated paper from these countries into the United States. While this government interference was intended to highlight the need for fully liberalized trade and protect the American firms and the domestic market from the unfair competition of these subsidized Asian products, in reality has done more harm to American firms than good by redirecting these products away from the American marketplace and into developing nations where they would be creating more competition for American paper products. In this international market, paper firms in industrialized nations face more institutional obstacles than their peers in emerging countries, not just in regard to their lack of state subsidies, but more importantly in regards to uneven environmental policies. Since paper production is the largest industrial consumer of water and the third largest industrial greenhouse gas emitter, not to mention the issue of deforestation, environmental policies play a paramount role in this industry's activities. On the global scale, the World Trade Organization is the primary body responsible for supervising international paper exchanges, and while it supports the green initiatives that certain nations have taken, it does not attempt to be an environmental organization and seeks to maintain its focus on trade policies. The WTO promotes full liberalization of this industry in hopes that deregulation will spur economic growth, which will provide for the resources for more countries to enact policies which reflect greater environmental concerns, which would currently be too burdensome. For example, China and Indonesia impose little environmental restrictions on their burgeoning paper industries, and their rapidly growing firms are reaping the benefits, while many firms located in the United States and Canada are subject to an ever-growing litany of difficult environmental policies which necessitate arduous changes in production process. For example, the most important policy in recent years for American paper producers has been the EPA's Boiler Maximum Achievable Control technology. This legislation proposes extensive reforms in commercial boiler usage, specifically new emission limits for industrial boilers, which currently only a handful of the thousands of boilers in the domestic paper industry could meet. The American Forest and Paper Association, along with politicians from many states with stakes in the forestry industry, are speaking out against this legislation due to the billions of dollars it would cost firms in attempting to make the necessary modifications to equipment. The American Forest and Paper Association represents the greater interests of the paper industry in Washington, D.C., and advocates for policies which reflect the values of the industry, such as postal reform in the Federal Postal Service so that it can remain functioning with greater government support and they won't lose that substantial client base. Another primary example of their policy objectives would be their push for transportation deregulation in the form of an increase in the national truck weight maximum to allow larger quantities to be transported at once. The AF&PA embodies the concern the industry has for its uncertain future domestically and internationally with the current increase in electronic technologies and rising environmental concerns. These two concerns represent a potential shift in the industry which could change who the winners and losers are overall. Current firms who succeed in the mass production of low-value paper products such as envelopes and lined paper could become losers when print media and traditional mail become obsolete. While those firms struggling with difficult environmental restrictions could be forced to embrace innovative green technology and eventually broach a new marketplace when wood-based products are less of a viable option.